Greetings, ladies and gents, and welcome to this latest edition of Read TFOS, where I take old stories I've narrated and update them to modern audio standards. This particular story is called Fire Breather, written by Lostfol. As Rovik began to wake up, he knew he was in trouble. His head was in a bag and his arms were bound behind him, and he would have given anything to sit upright for a moment. He had awakened in what felt and smelled like a cargo hold he was apparently being dragged out of. He had a vague memory of being half dragged and half carried by a pair of scallon roughs. As he woke up, he vaguely remembered their clawed hands grabbing him and being thrown into the cargo. But in the was as far as his abuse-rattled brain could get before he discovered his snout had been the first point of contact with the floor after being thrown through the hatch. As he spat out some blood, he overheard one of the Scalen assailants warn the other, "Careful, the boss watching him in good shape." He felt fear in the pit of his stomach as his knees began to shake. Only one in that region of space called the boss by his men. Everyone else knew him as the Fire Breather. "You're in deep shit now, you dumbass," Rovik thought to himself, feeling the strain on his shoulders from his arms being bound behind him. He couldn't see where they were going due to the bag over his head, but he knew who awaited him. "What could the Fire Breather possibly want with me? I've never borrowed from him or gotten crosswise with his men," he thought as he was shoved along. The Scalen race was not known to be the smartest, but were easily some of the toughest creatures amongst the sapient races, even beating out feline-like races like his own, the Crutal, in a fair fight. They were rumored to almost worship the Fire Breather. All he could think of was the stories told around dark lounges. It was said that the Fire Breather had been abducted from a pre-warped Deathworld where, and he was reputed to always have a flame near. He was known for his cunning and ruthlessness. In ensuring his freedom, he managed to even enslave his own slavers and sell them to the Korlax for a banquet they were planning. He knew this wasn't helping his state of mind. He felt more fear as he thought. Could the Fire Breather have possibly heard something of the alliance forming against him and think I'm involved? Relax, he told himself. Those are just stories told to scare people. No one is that bad. The stories were too over the top to be real, he had always felt. But as he was practically dragged along, he couldn't help but notice these Scalens seemed dressed in a peculiar manner, rather than in the tribal marking. He didn't see so much as felt the cloth on them, as he was carried between them. His mind briefly flashed over every story he had ever heard of the Fire Breather. He met a fellow Crutal in a bar one night, raving about having met the infamous figure. He claimed the Fire Breather looked like an infant without weapons or claws, except for the feeling of the claws digging into his flesh and the faint trickle of blood he felt coming from his hide. He would have been tempted to ask his captors some questions. The old Crutal had gone on about how dangerous the boss was and how they underestimated the lower races, he bitterly thought. The next day, the old man jumped off a building. Whatever he'd seen must have disturbed him greatly. Rovik felt his skin tighten and a shiver not completely born of fear as a cool air washed over him, accompanied by a smell of warrens in the lower Varga station. Even though he couldn't see, he knew the area was dimly lit and only the most dangerous and desperate residents on the station would linger in this particular area. Knowing few willingly would go into this realm, that pit in his stomach got deeper, the realization sinking in like an anchor that there would be no help. "Why have the gods turned on me like this?" he thought, as he felt a Scalen catch the back of his jumpsuit as he began to fall at a sudden appearance of stairs. Rovik knew these Scalen thought that they were being gentle, but he was pretty sure that he felt his shoulder pop out of joint as he landed. "What do they want with me? Why are they doing this? Is this how they recruit?" The last thought bringing a small bit of hope to him. Not every story about the Fire Breather was bad. He had heard of others who actually benefited if they were willing to get their hands dirty. Perhaps his own recent string of robbery feedings had gotten him noticed, and he was going through an initiation. He knew plenty of gangs that were rumored to have rough initiations. Then a sobering realization hit him. Those gangs were no longer around. all either joining the fire breather's empire, having tragic accidents, or simply disappearing. The thought he had been fetched for the most dangerous being in the station was sobering, even though the fog left from what he saw skull told him there was a severe whack to the skull. He heard old hinges of a metal hatch protest as their load was forced aside, then suddenly felt a chill like the very void of space. His kind was from a hot planet, and the extreme cold was something he never got used to. He could feel the slowing of his mind, and feeling like he was in the presence of death personified. How can they just snatch me from the street like this? This feels like a surreal nightmare, he thought, as his mind began to process just how perilous the situation had become. As he was shoved down into the ice-cold chair, he felt alloy shackles close over his arms and legs, replacing the leather ties. In the cold, his blood slowed such that he could barely struggle. Once secured, one of the Scalen pulled the hood off. Rovak blinked in surprise as he sat there and stared mouth agape as the two powerful, warm-blooded reptilian creatures stepped away. They were a terrifying race normally, but they almost looked comical in their punch-striped custom pants, vests, white shirts, and hats. Almost. It was so strange to see them wearing more than a bare minimum for survival. They liked to show their tribal markings. "This has got to be a dream," he said to himself. He jumped as the fog in his mind suddenly shattered and cleared. A soft voice with a rasp spoke. "The only problem is here the monsters are real." Even as it was said, he saw a billow of smoke. Looking towards it, he could make out a dark shape. Even the smoke seemed to move away from it as he walked towards him. That is, when the smell of something burning mixed with a strong alcoholic drink he couldn't identify assailed his senses, making his eyes water as he coughed. I hope this is an interview," he managed to choke out. The sudden bark of laughter cut him short. He felt that pit of fear return, this time almost bottomless. There was no illusion who was in charge here. As the dark shape neared, he could see the smoke appear to come out of him. He would occasionally lift a burning brown tube to his mouth and draw more smoke in. "And here starts the interrogation," Rovak thought as the fire breather neared. Rovak couldn't help but notice the immaculate, elaborate suit he wore, hat down to what appeared to be leather shoes. This creature didn't look dangerous, he thought, as he noted the soft skin and short stature. No prominent eyes, jaws, or other facial features. He almost felt a touch of hope. "If I could just get a hold of him." He almost jumped out of his skin when the small alien before him sent a cloud of white smoke out of his mouth, lifting a glass holding some form of amber liquid that smells like fuel. The cold was affecting him. It looked as if the creature was sucking in the fire as the angry red cherry on the end became brighter. "Gentlemen, today we have a learning opportunity," the fire breather began, to Rovak's surprise. "I normally don't involve myself in the business of others until they get involved in mine. Then, well, they've made their business mine." It was obvious he was addressing his associates. "Fire breather, I mean, sir," he started as he mentally cursed himself for not knowing how to speak to such a terrifying figure. "What have I—" He started as the individual held up a hand, lifting a single digit, in a move that unmistakably meant silence. It was a simple gesture, almost comical from one so small. Yet, something in those forward-facing blue-grey arms the fire breather seemed to use to take a measure of him suddenly made him hope that he'd managed to keep the worst of his fear from his voice. He didn't know the race, but considering the fire breather was feared through the entire region, made him not want to. As he watched another cloud of smoke coming from the creature, he couldn't help but wonder how it could possibly hold fire like that and drink fuel yet survive. As the smoke came out, he could smell the unmistakable scent of strong ethanol on it. Rovak tried to remember all he could about the creature standing in front of him, just looking at him. All he could remember was the reputed temper and cruelty he could display. "You see, never forget that we run a business here. There are rules and etiquette to how we behave. Otherwise, we are no better than beasts." The apparition in front of him continued. Again, silence and a cloud of smoke as the creature walked near enough he noticed faint scars covered one side of its face. He also noticed a walking pole tucked under one arm. It was a brightly polished alloy, with a tip shaped like the skull of some creature he didn't recognize on the top of it. The rod looked solid and heavy. Much of the rest of his garb was completely strange to him. His grey outfit hardly seemed practical. It would have almost been funny if he were not in the situation he was. Rovik found he couldn't look away from the cold orbs as the smoke wafted around the creature's form, giving the demon a more hellish look. It struck him how much the fire-breather looked like the demons his people once feared, a creature his kind claimed lived in the volcanoes of their world. For the first time in years, he heard his mother's cold, harsh voice in the back of his fear-fogged brain. "If you do evil, they will come for you." His thoughts were again shattered by the harsh, gravel voice as it asked a figure he hadn't noticed before. "Kestrel, are you sure this is the one?" He heard the gravelly voice of the scarred figure opposite him rumble. The name sounded so familiar, like he had heard it recently. He found himself wondering, trying to remember where he had heard it, as a figure walked up next to the fire-breather. It was just a kid, one of those stinking little gutter rats. This one looked like he'd lived there based on its clothing and matted hair. The species was officially the Norata, but had a strong resemblance to rodents that all planets seemed to have. "They are no better than the pest they appear to be," he found himself thinking, as he sat helplessly in that chair, restrained. He found it easier to stare at the gutter rat than the dark, menacing figure before him. "Yes, I am sure. I will never forget him. He killed and ate them in front of me," the young Norata said, drawing out the answers being a racial trait brought on by their misshapen faces. Rovik had killed hundreds of them for food. This one was starting to seem more familiar. His markings almost like a meal he had a few days ago. There was almost no protection for the lesser species, and his father was important, so he fed with impunity. He suddenly felt sick. "Oh shit, this is over a meal. They're just gutter rats," Rovik snarled, turning his attention towards the gutter rat. Upon seeing the young one flinch, a thought occurred to him. Maybe he could turn the tables on his captors. "I think I remember your parents begging me and whimpering. I savored their fear. I left that meal with the hoard they had hidden away and a full belly," Rovik snarled, clearly enjoying the fear and pain he was inflicting on the young gutter rat. "You can take comfort in that they had tasted good. As good as your gutter rats can," he sneered. From the corner of his eye he caught a look from the Scalin that had brought his verbal assault to a sudden stop as the ground stopped those who fell from a building. It was a look of pity. He never saw the movement that brought the rod down across his arm, but he felt all three of the bones within shattered. He let out a scream that turned into an instinctual growl. His assailant, though, met his eyes, those cold eyes looking more grey than blue. They were as dead to his pain as he had been to his meals. As the fire-breathers took off his jacket, a metal rolling table was brought up. Rovik watched in horror as he straightened his tools. "That, gentlemen, is an example of poor etiquette. It is unnecessary rudeness. We are here because of business." Speaking to no one in particular, the fire-breather started to talk. "It is amazing how, even in the depths of space, beings who have conquered the boundaries of their planet still act like wild animals. You would think that we would be a bit more civilized," the emphasis leaving it dripping with venom. Turning towards the gutter rat, Rovik suddenly had an understanding of his prey he never expected to. Though the fire-breather addressed the boy, his eyes never left his prey. "It's okay, Kestrel. Your parents paid for me for protection. This one brought me to shame in the most uncivil way. Some creatures only understand violence. Are you sure you want to move forward with this? If you do, there is no road out." Rovik had a sick feeling as the young gutter rat nodded. "I am, boss." At that, the fire-breather nodded, picking up a wooden club, oddly shaped and obviously custom-made, over to the young gutter rat. He had no idea what a Louisville slugger was, but the name engraved on the club did little for Rovik's sudden distress. Distress that cost him control over his spells as he heard, "Very well, Avenge your parents, son." Rovak watched in horror as the young garter rat took the club and at first stared at it. When the garter rat looked up, the fire breather smiled, showing those omnivorous teeth. "We take care of our family here, son. Consider this your last goodbye to your kind and good parents. And if you want, you can stay with me. But we may have work for you. Now, we only have an hour until I have to leave for an engagement, so let's show this community what happens when you break the rules." One desperate last gambit Rovak found himself playing. He begged, You can't do this," he started. I have diplomatic status on the station from my race." He didn't even realize that he was starting to play it. But he was hoping his estranged father's position on the council would be enough to sway the monster. No, monsters before him. The fire breather looked back at him and let a smile cross his face that never seemed to reach those cold eyes. As he began to talk, one of the skellen came up with a chair and another rolled a set of leaves. The smile was that of a predator for its prey. "Meat! I would normally say I hope you enjoyed your last meal. Now might be even a good time to throw out the ever-famous say hello to my little friend. But this isn't anything personal. It's just business. That meal, as you called it, was under my protection. You disgraced me, insulting my word of protection, and it cost this young man his family," the monster said as he took in a long pull of the amber liquid in the glass and moved towards his chair. Rovak suddenly felt his fur stand on end as he watched the smoke come from the creature's nose and mouth. He had been so distracted, he almost didn't see as the blow that shattered the bones in his other arm landed. Hours later, the bloodied form of the cat-like alien was limp in the chair, only the slow rise and fall of his chest proof he lived. The rat-like Norata were treated as food and slaves. They had been deeply wronged, just like the Scalen, who were treated as simpletons. The society was even more messed up than back home. These races had cared for him after his abduction, and their sharp minds and eyes were essential to avoid the dangers of this region. Not to mention, they were able to craft or scavenge almost anything he wanted. They did not deserve the treatment the other races thumped upon them. Scott didn't care. He had long since decided this was all a dream, and if he was going to play a role, it would be from the Godfather. Kestrel looked tired, and as Scott looked at his custom-made watch, he realized that he was almost out of time. He had a hard time adjusting to the 20-time units of some kind the station used. He had some of the Norata who made his toys about how he missed his watch. They had surprised him with this one as a gift. So Scott took another sip of the whiskey he had managed to finally have produced. It was sold as high-end personal equipment fuel, but he had craved the taste. The cigars had been even harder to find. The kid shows a lot of potential, and it would be ironic to send a rat after a rat, he mentally chuckled. Looking back at the bloody lump of matted hair in the chair, he realized with a touch of disgust how some of it had splashed across his shoes. Walking over to Kestrel, he said with a smile, "Good job, son, and welcome to the family. We will wrap up here. You go onto the house and get cleaned up in some proper clothing. I'm sure Vinny's sister will have something for you to eat, too." He noted with approval the look of admiration the young boy laid upon him. He had given him something no one else could, his dignity back, and closure on a painful chapter of his life. Part of Scott hated this. This is truly unnecessary if these barbarians would just understand and follow the rules, he bitterly thought, as he walked back over to the table, picking up the small shotgun, or at least approximation his men had made. They had struggled with the idea of a weapon that fired a blast of little pieces, as opposed to a bolt of plasma or energy. He crushed out his cigar as he raised the weapon up to rest against his shoulder, turning back towards the quivering mass still held in the chair by more broken bones than anyone cared to ask. He was surprised to see it had regained consciousness. "Please," was all the sack of meat managed to say before Scott fired his plasma shotgun into its chest. In some ways, the hybrid weapon was truly a thing of beauty that he had to admit as the blue and yellow flames enveloped the now still body. Turning back to the table, he began to put everything back in place. He carefully inspected himself to ensure that he didn't get any on him after he wiped his shoes clean with a rag. As the body still smolders, he looked towards the two raptor-like aliens. "Vinny, would you mind dealing with the mess and help your sister get this young man cleaned up? Make sure people know what he did. Also, spread the word on those who are under my protection. If we have to repeat, it'll be most uncivil." Smoke still wafted off the burnt meat, some broken bones showing where the flesh was eaten away. "Yes, boss," Vinny replied. He wasn't his real name, but he had embraced it all along with the ceremony Scott had held when making Vinny a made man. "Brack, would you bring the car round? We have an appointment with the head of the port. I've gotten a note how ruse worked, and we have them all in cargo bay discussing us. Time to vent the trash. It would be rude of us to be late," Scott continued softly. He liked the Skellan. They looked like raptors and were far more intelligent than the other races gave them credit for. He still found it amazing how, despite not being the biggest or strongest, they followed him. It appeared only humans knew how to run a criminal business, he thought as he lit a fresh cigar. He still chuckled that the aliens called him Fire Breather. He had tried to explain he only breathed the smoke, but they kept pointing out how much smoke he exhaled. He eventually decided it wasn't worth fighting. Well, at least he would show them how to be civil as he removed the competition, Scott thought wistfully as he headed towards the vehicle. He had to admit, with the way the aliens ran things, business was good. End of story. I would just like to thank the T5 supporters: Bushmaster 117, Casper Arnholtz, Draxzoon WRE, Elijah Silvercross, Gray, John Carrington, and Severin Cerberus. Thank you very much.